Okay, Jim, final question this week. This one's coming from me. Recently, news broke out that Teijo Khan has passed away.
Oh, no.
Any memories of Teijo Khan, and who do you think was the worst member of Paul Jones's army?
Oh, good God. Well, first of all, Teijo Khan, how old was he?
Well, I don't have that in front of me.
How did you hear about this?
A couple weeks ago, people started posting that Teijo Khan passed away.
For everybody out there, and I'm not knocking this guy that's saying who, it's 'cause he didn't wrestle very long. But he was part of Crockett Promotions during a hot period. I can't remember what his real name was. But he wrestled as Teijo Khan, Teijokhan. He was kind of an Oriental martial arts gimmick guy. And he was a good athlete, had a good physique. He worked for Crockett some underneath on the card. Then when they bought Kansas City, they sent him out there along with Big Bubba Rogers and some of the other guys that were underneath for Crockett that were still good workers and could blossom out there in Kansas City for the time that they had that territory. I think he worked Florida in the same way, and then did independence for a few years. Might have been in WCW a brief period of time, but from
64 years old, by the way.
And older than me. I would, he started later. He started later in his life then, I would guess, because I don't think he started till like 85-ish. So he would have been almost 30 and wrestled until maybe actually he might have been in the WWF at some point, that late 80s, early 90s period. I don't think wrestled much after the early 90s. I hadn't seen or heard of him in quite some time. But he was a nice guy in the locker room and a good worker. He just, he wasn't around long and didn't get featured very, very much. I hate to hear that.
He was also one of the cannibals in a movie I love, Body Slam. The Barbarian and Teijo Khan were Axe and Hammer, the cannibals, managed by Captain Lou Morano.
Yes, and guess who that might have been? Yeah, that's right. And that was, we've told the story when Barbarian was out there filming the movie and got in trouble in the hotel bar. Teijo Khan, but Teijo was a laid back guy. He was very, laid back and nice and friendly, quiet, and, did his thing. I don't have a ton of memories of specifically this great match or whatever. It's been so long and I haven't thought of him, but, he was a nice guy. I guess 64 isn't old enough to be dying, but it's not young enough to be shocking, I guess. I'm in that period of time now myself. Not old enough to be ready to die, but not young enough to where it's shocking.
He was a member of Paul Jones's army as well as the House of Guleen.
Oh, and that's right. And he worked in Memphis and was managed by Mark Guleen. That was what, like 86-ish?
87.
87. Okay, see, I'm close. Who else was in he was not the worst member of Paul Jones's army, but who else was in, poor old Pez Whatley, when they made him Shaska Whatley and he was wearing the tux hat and the tails. Teijo Khan, Barbarian was in there. I love Barb. He was a great talent, but it
Baron
seemed
von Raschke.
Poor Baron. He was about, well.
Any one of you going to say was in the group is poor this guy. Oh, this guy.
Well, Baron was about ready to retire then. He was just about at the end of his career. And, and he was a big name in the business, but they just put everybody. It seemed like that Paul Jones's army was the catch-all. And I think Dusty did it that way on purpose because Paul had the never-ending feud with Handsome Jimmy Valiant. And at that point, Jimmy was so over, but he was doing almost nothing in the ring. And the whole complete style of, Crockett Promotions had changed with the Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express and the Road Warriors and Flair and the Horsemen and Dusty and Magnum and all those. And then, Handsome, I love Handsome. He was one of my first favorites from the time I saw him on Bruiser's TV, but he was a personality, but his matches were not getting the 6 Tokyo Dome stars, right? So Dusty would program Paul Jones and his men against Handsome, and he'd keep all of those matches kind of contained in one spot on the card where it could draw money and it didn't have to be a good match. Does that make any sense? And it did draw money, and it didn't, and the matches weren't any good. But yeah, I don't think Teijo was the worst member of the group, but I hate to knock any of those people. It was a motley band, and Paul Jones was a big name as a wrestler in the Carolinas and Florida and Georgia, but he wasn't a good manager. It just didn't translate ever for me and for a lot of people. So
what about the Mighty Wilbur?
There's the worst member of Paul Jones when he brought in the Mighty Wilbur.
And then he started calling him Puddinhead and upset him. What the hell was going on there?
And by the way, for those people wondering, well, why the fuck were they booking Paul Jones as a manager? Paul Jones was factored in. He was grandfathered in because of his dedication to the Crockett territory for so long, going back to Jim Crockett Sr., that Paul Jones, Klondike Bill, George Harris, and one or two other people were going to be around in some capacity as long as Crockett was around. And this is evidenced by the fact that once Crockett sold, they brought George Scott in, who was good friends with George Scott, Paul Jones. Paul Jones was dropped as a manager and became an agent. And when George Scott was fired, Paul Jones was not used as an agent anymore.
Now, it has been said by certain people that work there that Paul Jones may have had the reputation for being a stooge for the office when he was a manager for Crockett.
Is that a question or just a blanket statement?
I was making a statement, but I specifically said it so it could be taken either way, as a question or a statement.
Well, I mean, it depends on the definition of the word stooge.
Turns around, runs to the phone, calls the office, and tells them what's going on.
Paul was good friends with the Booker and good friends with Crockett and good friends with Crockett Sr. and was always figured in there, and that was his home, and he lived in Charlotte, and he was taking care of the company. And if people were doing things that possibly he figured weren't good for the business, or possibly they needed to be moved out of a spot that he might be moved into, or whatever the case, he might in some cases. And Paul was a fairly straight guy. He was older at the time. He was in his 40s at least. He wasn't out partying and drinking and doing the Peruvian blow and all the other stuff. So I don't think he just hid and waited behind bushes to gather evidence on people, but I have a feeling him being a straight guy and sort of an unofficial member of the office at that point, that if some of the guys were doing things, he'd probably mention it.
Was there ever a stooge that did hide behind bushes and just looked to always gather dirt on people? And
that fucking George Scott's son, that no good Byron Scott, I've never heard Bobby Eaton talk bad about people. He hated that fucking kid because it looked like he was on heroin. He was on something. It was obvious. And it looked like, and he would actually walk around in the locker room and start leaning sideways so his left ear would be closer to your conversation as he walked past. And Bobby would look up, stooge. He hated him. And that's when they brought in Strongbow's son.
Mark Young.
Yeah, no, Vincent Young.
Vincent Young. He became Mark Young, I think, in the WWF.
Yes, but Vincent Young, he was a break dancer, and the people laughed it out of the building. But George Scott was friends with Strongbow from years before, so he brought it. But that Byron Scott, yeah, he looked like he was on heroin all the time. He was a stooge just straight out. He was slimy looking fuck, and Bobby Eaton didn't like him. And if Bobby Eaton didn't like you, there was something the matter with you. So that whole time period there was a lot of potential stooges going on. But you notice whenever you said, well, who really was a stooge, I instantly named George Scott's son.